All right, welcome back. So, the title of this mini lecture is The Early Republic, Part 1. We're going to talk about America in the 1780s and 90s and into the early 1800s. We'll look at kind of what people are doing, how they're living their lives, kind of the political situation. And what we're going to do is center on 5 terms for you to be thinking about and key in on as you do your readings to kind of help you get a better understanding of the time period. All right, so let's dig in. Number 1, Alexander Hamilton. He's famous today because he's on money. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury, right? Lin-Manuel Miranda made a musical about him, which was really popular. Hamilton does a lot of good stuff, right? So he comes from St. Croix, eventually makes his way to New York, serves in the Revolution, is on Washington's staff, eventually is at the Constitutional Convention, first Secretary of the Treasury, and is a leading political actor before his death in a duel in the early 1800s. His debt structuring, his role as sort of Secretary of the Treasury kind of helps set up America's financial system, and these are good things. But we would be troubled, I think, by the reality of a guy like Alexander Hamilton, not just in terms of his personal affairs and cheating on his wife and all that, but he's not exactly someone who supported what we might call free speech for the average individual. He would have had a problem with that. So I would argue that Hamilton's legacy is relatively, somewhat conflicted, right? So it depends on kind of how you look at it when it comes to a guy like Alexander Hamilton. All right, number 2, the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation is the government that exists for the United States, the national government, in the 1780s up until the Constitution. Now, it's a government that reflects its time. So this would mean that there are positives and negatives to it. There's no national executive branch, no president, right, to go with this. The legislature exists, but it's limited. In the 1770s, when colonies were becoming states and they create new governments, there's a real concern over tyranny. And so they want to limit the power of governing institutions, right? So the government does accomplish some things. Land ordinances are a big deal. There are questions of debt assumption that they struggle with. So the Articles of Confederation kind of leads us into that initial post-war era. Now, this leads us, though, to our 3rd point, which is Shays' Rebellion. Now, Daniel Shays was a Revolutionary War Army captain, and he was living in Massachusetts, and this rebellion gets going around 1786. And it has to do with questions of debt payments and really kind of how these veterans and how their communities were being treated in the post-war era. Now, they, start shutting down courts and issues of tax collectors, this kind of thing, and the military's called in. Eventually it's put down, right? The rebellion doesn't succeed. But you have some individuals who would call for a debate over what kind of government, that should exist here kind of as they move forward. And this is really what leads us to the Constitutional Convention, right? And so this is going to be our 4th point. So the Constitutional Convention happens in Philadelphia, happens in 1787 from May to September. The delegates who attend it, and there's just over 50 of them who do, they have a number of consensus assumptions. Some of those are positive, others are negative. Remember, we're talking generally about, elite, white, in some cases slave-owning guys here. They're not perhaps anti-patriarchy or anything like that. And their consensus assumptions are things like, anti-tyranny. Their consensus assumptions are things like, as the country colonies or territories that would become states should be treated relatively the same, right? This idea of debt assumption, and the question of how to structure representation. Now, eventually, of course, there'll be the Great Compromise, but there's a number of other, of course, compromises such as the 3/5 during the Constitutional Convention that are good for us to know. All right, the 5th point, of course, is Philadelphia. Philadelphia was a very central and significant urban space in the late 18th century, from its position in the Revolution to its time during the Constitutional Convention to its time in the 1790s when you have things like a yellow fever epidemic or pandemic that hits the city. and really kind of reflects how America's national government is coping with those kinds of things during the time. Philadelphia is an important space. Now that space transforms in the 19th century with industrialization, changes in technology, but that would be true for many of the early urban spaces of the American Republic. All right, thanks so much.